Hello everyone. This is a new video series on serialization. I will talk about the basics of serialization and the three common methods, namely JSON, XML, and binary. Serialization basically is the process of converting an object into a form that can be stored or transported easily. Objects are instances of classes and they are converted during the process of serialization to a stream of bytes. This stream can then be stored as a file, saved onto a database, or sent over internet to web services. The reverse of this process, converting a byte stream into an object, is called deserialization. I will explain it more clearly using a simple example. In this example, I wish to save the player details so that when the player replays the game, the details are already available to them. They don't need to provide it on every game session. Here is my player data class with simple variables like name, age, and gender. Every time the game starts, a new instance of this class is created, and it is filled with the default values, which for a string is an empty string and for float is 0. This instance is also called an object. Using the player input, this object will then be filled with player data. So the state of my object changes from empty to a new state. And this state is what we want to save and recreate when the player plays the game again. So that in the next session, instead of creating an empty instance, we create this state of our object. This can be done by first serializing this state of our object and storing it as a file. And in the next play session, we will deserialize our file and recreate or clone the same state that we saved. JSON and XML are the two common standards, and this is how our object looks when we serialize it in these two forms. So the first one is your JSON representation of the state of your object, and the next one is your XML representation. Both of these standards have their pros and cons and will be discussed in the later videos. Serialization is used extensively by the Unity game engine itself for things like saving data of mono behaviors and scriptable objects, editor scripting, prefabs, instantiation, and saving and loading your scenes. But in this series, I will only focus on the use of serialization that you may encounter in a game. Some examples of which are saving game data, like the example that I just showed you, where you save the player details onto a file. The next use can be of the web-based services. So if you use some online services like a leaderboard or saving your player progression onto a web server, so the serialization can be really helpful in those cases to talk between a client and the server. The third use case is your separation of data from code, which means that your data is stored as files independent of the logic or independent of the code that your game runs on. And this separated data can be easily modified or edited by your game designers as it is in a form of a file. Then other use case is that you can also design and save your whole levels in the form of a file instead of making it a Unity scene. And the last use case of serialization is that if your data is separated from the code and your levels and your game entities can be described in a serialized form in a form of a file, it is very easy for modders to make changes to your game. It is easy for them to modify values or even add their own entities to your existing game engine that in which all your logic and all your code runs on. There are some standard ways of serialization, namely JSON, XML, and binary. I will talk about each one of them in subsequent videos. I will start with JSON, which is a very easy to use, lightweight, and language independent standard. And I will show you how you can use the inbuilt Unity JSON serializer to convert your data classes into their JSON format, either as a string or save it as a file.